On a warm spring evening, the world looked to the sky and saw not airplanes nor rockets, but something larger than life floating across the horizon. Imagine an age where colossal vessels drifted through the air as calmly as ocean liners upon the sea. These ships were not bound by rails or waves. They sailed in silence above villages and rivers, casting shadows that made people stop and stare. For many, the sight of such a machine felt like magic, a glimpse into a future where the heavens themselves could be conquered. In our timeline, the golden dream of these sky giants was cut short by fire and disaster. But let us imagine for a moment that this tragedy never arrived. Instead of flames, we see the smooth descent of the great airship, its landing lights piercing the night, its crew calm, and its passengers stepping off to greet the world. The Hindenburg lands safely. The newspapers the next morning praised German engineering, and crowds gathered to book their own voyage across the Atlantic. The age of airships continues with a renewed confidence and wonder. The engineers in Friedrichshafen refine their craft. They speak of safer materials and stronger frames. They imagine a fleet that could circle the globe in regular intervals, connecting continents with speed, comfort, and spectacle. America controls helium and remains cautious of sharing it, but Germany, desperate to maintain its lead in aviation, finds new ways to extract and purify the gas. Alternatives are explored, and through political bargaining, limited supplies of helium begin to flow across the ocean. Rival nations, watching with envy, do not want to be left behind. France and Britain invest in their own rigid airships, each one larger than the last, each promising to carry more passengers and cargo. What would this world look like by the dawn of the 1940s? Airships are no longer a curiosity, but an industry. Ocean liners still cross the seas, but now they face competition from ships in the sky. A voyage that once took days by water now takes less than half that time by air. Wealthy families, businessmen, and even adventurous travelers choose the aerial route to save precious time. Cities begin to construct special towers and docking stations, massive mooring masts rising above skylines. Some nations planned airports, not just for airplanes, but for fleets of airships, with hangars large enough to shelter giants of the sky. Military planners do not miss the possibilities. They see reconnaissance vessels that can patrol borders for days at a time, floating quietly beyond the range of artillery. They imagine airships carrying radio equipment, scanning oceans for submarines, or delivering supplies to distant armies. The Great War in our history was dominated by trenches and early aircraft, but in this alternate course, airships would play a more decisive role. Each side would build them, each side would fear them. Picture a night raid not of a single Zeppelin crossing into London, but of dozens, enormous machines floating high over the city, dropping bombs and propaganda leaflets, the thunder of anti-aircraft guns echoing as spotlights cut through the dark. And yet, we must pause and ask ourselves, what did the airship truly offer? Speed was not its strength. Compared to the airplane, weight was always its enemy. Even the most advanced models struggled to carry as much cargo as a train or ship. Yet there was something irresistible about them. Their size, their silence, their presence in the sky. Unlike airplanes cramped and noisy, airships promised comfort. Lounges with windows stretched wide, promenades where one could stroll as if on a luxury liner, dining rooms where music played softly as the landscape passed slowly beneath. The wealthy saw not only a vessel, but a symbol of status, the very height of modernity. Had this dream continued, had the Hindenburg landed safely, the world of aviation could have unfolded differently. The airplane still existed, still improving each year, but its dominance might have been delayed. Instead of passenger airlines rising so quickly in the 1930s, perhaps airship companies would have remained central longer. International routes between New York and Rio, Berlin and Cairo, London and Bombay could have been mapped by these aerial leviathans. For a time, humanity might have believed the sky itself was meant to be ruled not by wings, but by giants of gas and steel. The story of alternate history is always about choices and chances. At one moment, the course bends into disaster. In another, it bends into opportunity. If we step into this other timeline, where fire never consumed the Hindenburg, we see a world reshaped by ambition. Nations racing not only to build faster planes, but to design greater airships, and to capture the imagination of travelers who look up and believe the future belongs to the skies.
As the 1940s unfold, the world begins to transform under the slow, drifting shadow of airships. The Second World War arrives not as it did in our history, with squadrons of dive bombers and blitzkrieg tanks, but with a strange blend of old and new. Massive airships hang above battlefields, watching like patient predators. Below them, armies still march across the ground. But high above, a different kind of war takes place. The German fleet of rigid airships becomes the pride of the Reich. Their designers, convinced that these sky leviathans are untouchable, construct models longer than 2 city blocks, armored with lightweight alloys and filled with precious helium. These ships are not only tools of surveillance, but carriers of soldiers, weapons, and supplies. Instead of relying solely on U-boats to strangle the Atlantic, Germany sends convoys of airships gliding silently over the ocean, hunting Allied shipping with spotlights and radios, coordinated with submarines. Airships could stay in the sky for days, even weeks, far longer than any aeroplane of the time. And commanders saw in them a chance to dominate oceans without fleets of surface warships. The Allies, however, are not blind. Britain and the United States scramble to counter this new threat. They invest in fighter planes with greater altitude and endurance. They develop experimental incendiary ammunition meant to tear through the gas cells of a Zeppelin with a single strike. Radar, a technology still in its infancy, suddenly becomes a matter of survival, not only for spotting fast aircraft, but for detecting vast shadows of airships drifting miles away. The Battle of Britain in this timeline is remembered not only for Spitfire's dueling Messerschmitts, but for daring night raids against colossal German airships that loomed above the cities. The image of a small fighter plane darting beneath the belly of a sky fortress became one of the defining symbols of this alternate war. But while military conflict raged, so too did civilian fascination. Every nation with the resources to build them wanted its own fleet of passenger airships. The United States expanded its infrastructure with towering mooring masts in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, envisioning the day when a passenger could board in one city and float across the continent in quiet luxury, arriving days later, refreshed rather than exhausted. In South America, Brazil became a hub of aerial travel, with its tropical ports serving as crossroads between North America, Europe, and Africa. Airship voyages were not simply about speed, they were experiences to be remembered. Couples danced in gilded lounges while jazz bands played beneath chandeliers. Gentlemen smoked in observation decks while gazing at the clouds beneath their feet. Chefs prepared fine meals in cramped but ingenious kitchens, turning the journey itself into a spectacle for the wealthy and adventurous. Owning a ticket for a transatlantic voyage aboard one of these sky palaces was as much a status symbol as owning a grand estate or expensive automobile. Still, the airship had weaknesses. Every engineer knew them. Every commander feared them. They were large targets, slow to maneuver, vulnerable in storms, and costly to construct. Yet the momentum of nations invested in their future carried them forward.
In many ways, the airship was less a practical machine and more a symbol of modern identity. A country with its own fleet was a country that had reached the heights of industrial ambition. But by the end of the 1940s, however, the balance began to shift again. Aeroplanes, powered by stronger engines and improved fuels, proved themselves in the war. They crossed oceans faster than even the most advanced airships. They carried greater numbers of passengers for less cost. Airports expanded across continents, making plane travel more accessible to the middle classes. The airship remained luxurious, but increasingly it was seen as outdated, a slower relic of an earlier dream. But because the Hindenburg had never burned in front of the cameras, because the world had never seen passengers consumed by fire on live broadcast, the airship retained its dignity even as its dominance faded. In this timeline, no schoolchild grows up with the iconic photograph of flames devouring a giant vessel. Instead, they remember grand posters advertising flights to exotic lands and heroic stories of airships in wartime. This gave the craft a legacy of romance and honor rather than of tragedy. The cultural memory of these ships would linger long after their decline. Architects in the 1950s still imagined floating cities suspended by vast gas bags. Urban planners spoke of airborne hotels that could circle the globe while hosting hundreds of guests. Novelists filled their pages with scenes of daring escapes aboard dirigibles, soaring over mountains and deserts. The age of the airship might be ending in reality, but in the imagination, it was eternal. Thus, the world of the mid-20th century became one of contrasts. On the ground, highways stretched across nations. Railways still thundered with locomotives. In the sky, aeroplanes carried businessmen and tourists at growing speed. But above them all, sometimes slower, sometimes grander, airships still drifted across the horizon. Their golden age extended decades longer than in our world, their presence shaping how generations thought about the very meaning of flight.
By the dawn of the 1950s, the airship had become more than a machine, it was a cultural monument. Each one that appeared on the horizon drew eyes upward, as if the very sky had bent to human will. The nations that still funded fleets did so not only for transport or strategy, but for prestige. Their airships carried flags across continents, announcing power, progress, and modernity. In Europe, the great capitals adapted to their presence. Paris had a tower not only for sightseeing, but for docking. London redesigned part of its Thames embankment with a mooring station that could receive vessels the size of cathedrals. Berlin displayed its fleet in annual parades that filled the sky with white giants drifting in formation. The Soviet Union, unwilling to be overshadowed, unveiled its own rigid airships cloaked in red banners, promising that communism, too, could master the heavens. Yet behind the spectacle, the cracks were showing. Engineers knew the limits of the technology. They worked tirelessly to lighten frames, to refine engines, to manage the delicate balance of lift and weight. But every innovation met the same constraint. The airplane simply did the job faster and cheaper. A jet engine roaring across the Atlantic in mere hours could achieve what an airship required days to accomplish. As jetliners became accessible to businessmen and middle-class families alike, the once exclusive charm of the airship seemed increasingly impractical. But memory and myth carried these vessels far beyond logic. Writers, filmmakers, and artists clung to their romantic presence. Airships appeared in cinema not as outdated relics, but as symbols of grandeur. Scenes of lovers meeting in observation lounges, spies plotting in smoky cabins, explorers drifting over deserts in search of ancient secrets. Their sheer size and silence carried a poetic weight no airplane could match.
They became icons of an alternate modernity, one foot in the industrial age and one in a dream. Meanwhile, militaries searched for new roles for them. Gone were the days of massive bombing raids or ocean patrols, yet specialized tasks remained. Some airships were converted into flying radar stations, hovering above coastlines for weeks at a time. Others served in Arctic exploration, carrying scientists and supplies across frozen seas where runways were scarce. The United States Navy experimented with airborne aircraft carriers, deploying small planes from the belly of a dirigible like birds from a nest. While these experiments often ended with mixed success, they captured imaginations across the world. Newspapers reported them with awe as proof that the airship still had mysteries left to reveal. And in developing nations, where infrastructure was sparse, airships offered possibilities. Railroads required steel, highways demanded concrete, airports needed runways, but an airship needed only a mast and a field. This made them attractive to regions in Africa, South America, and parts of Asia, where governments sought connection across vast wildernesses. Some schemes even proposed fleets of cargo airships, delivering goods where roads could not reach. They were slower than trucks, but required far less fuel and could bypass terrain that otherwise cut villages off from trade. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the airship might find a second life, not as a luxury liner, but as a practical bridge for an emerging world. But global culture is shaped not only by machines, but by perception. By the early 1960s, the airplane had become the true symbol of progress. Jets soared at heights and speeds unthinkable only decades before. Commercial airlines sold the promise of arriving in the morning in Paris and dining by evening in New York. The airship could not compete with that rhythm of modern life. It was graceful but too slow, elegant but too costly, noble but impractical. Still, they lingered. Some nations maintained their fleets for ceremonial purposes, much like warships kept for tradition rather than war. Others converted their grandest airships into floating hotels, drifting above tourist routes, offering week-long journeys filled with views few would ever forget. Couples celebrated honeymoons in the skies. Families booked cabins for once-in-a-lifetime adventures. Politicians hosted summits within the hushed chambers of airships gliding above neutral waters. In these moments, the airship became less a vehicle of necessity and more a theater of imagination, a stage upon which history itself played out. As the century moved forward, the dream refused to vanish. The image of a gleaming silver giant floating above clouds remained etched into collective memory. Whenever people imagined alternate futures, steampunk worlds, or retro visions of tomorrow, they inevitably pictured airships sailing gracefully across painted skies. That is perhaps their greatest legacy, not the cargo they carried, nor the wars they fought, but the dream they left behind. The idea that humanity could master the air, not only with speed and fire, but with elegance and patience. By the late 20th century, the age of airships was no longer measured in fleets or battles, but in stories and symbols. They had become rare sights on the horizon, yet when one appeared, it still carried with it a quiet power. People stopped what they were doing to gaze upward. Children pointed, parents explained, and older generations remembered an era when these vessels promised a future of wonder. In this alternate timeline, where the Hindenburg never burned, the airship had been allowed to decline gracefully, not in tragedy, but in dignity. Unlike in our reality, where fiery images seared into memory, here the decline was gradual, like the setting of a sun. Cities slowly dismantled their mooring towers. Airlines took over the bulk of international travel. Governments turned resources to jets and rockets. Yet in museums, in paintings, in cultural memory, the airship remained larger than life, a relic of human imagination. Technology marched forward, as it always does. Supersonic passenger planes entered the skies. Satellites orbited the Earth. Rockets touched the moon. Yet whenever visions of the future were drawn, there was often still an airship drifting among the clouds. Architects dreamed of floating laboratories suspended over oceans. Environmentalists in the 1980s imagined fleets of solar-powered dirigibles monitoring forests and weather systems. Entrepreneurs in the developing world revived old plans for cargo airships to carry supplies to villages with no roads. It seemed the airship, even in its twilight, always found a way to haunt the dreams of innovators. What made these machines endure was not simply their utility, but their aura. They were at once vast and fragile, serene yet menacing, technological yet romantic. They embodied a different philosophy of flight, one that was not about conquering the air with speed and noise, but about inhabiting it with patience and grace. They turned the sky into an ocean and themselves into ships of cloud. Their cabins echoed not with the roar of engines, but with quiet conversation, clinking glasses, and soft footsteps across polished floors. Culturally, they became metaphors. Novelists used them to represent utopias suspended between heaven and earth. Filmmakers cast them as stages for drama, where lovers, spies, and revolutionaries confronted destiny while the world turned silently below. Poets wrote of them as dreamlike leviathans, symbols of ambition and fragility. Songs spoke of drifting away in silver ships carried by winds toward unknown horizons. They became part of the language of imagination, like castles in the sky or ships sailing beyond the edge of the world. And even in this alternate 20th century, their influence would not be forgotten by engineers of the 21st. With climate change, rising fuel costs, and renewed interest in sustainable travel, some visionaries would return to the idea of the lighter-than-air craft. New prototypes appeared, sleek, solar-powered, and computer-guided, designed not for glamour, but for efficiency. Cargo could be moved with less fuel, emissions could be cut, vast distances crossed without highways or harbors. The old dream found a new purpose, and in a strange twist, the romance of the past aligned with the demands of the future. The legacy of the airship, then, is not measured by how many passengers they carried or how many wars they fought. It is measured by the way they shaped human imagination, by the way they lingered long after their time had passed. In this world without the disaster of fire, they are remembered not as symbols of failure, but as monuments of possibility. They remind us that progress does not always move in straight lines, that sometimes even the most impractical of dreams can leave a mark far deeper than practical machines ever will. As one stands on a quiet evening and sees the stars above, it is tempting to imagine the silhouette of a great ship gliding between clouds, its windows glowing, its engines humming softly, carrying stories across the sky. In truth, whether such ships sail in reality or only in memory, they belong to us still. They are part of the human story, the part that dares to ask, what if we could turn the heavens into an ocean and ourselves into sailors of the air? And so, the tale closes not with an explosion, not with a catastrophe, but with a gentle fading into history, a long twilight of silver ships drifting across generations, leaving behind not ashes, but dreams. In that sense, the age of airships never truly ended. It continues every time we look upward and imagine a horizon filled not with speed and fire, but with grace and wonder.